Today, last month we looked at Maester Cressen's prologue in A Storm of Swords, which is all about Stannis. And me and Limburg both really like Stannis, so we were like, hey, let's look at more of his plot line. And also looking at a whole chapter, it takes a little bit too long, so we thought it might be good to go through the first Davos chapter and just talk about the scenes with Stannis. Anything you want to say about it before we get started? Presumptively, Limburg?
I want to say that I tried to pick out the meat of the chapter, and I have given us our little ingress to know where we are. If you have never read the chapter, it might be a little disorienting, but let's face it, Martin is a bit wordy at
Careful.
times.
Careful. No, I'm just kidding.
A bit wordy, a bit happy about his
Verbose.
words. Yes, so
Yeah.
I tried to cut out the fluff. Hello, Sci-Fi.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, hi, Salaya. Happy to be here for it live.
Yes, hello.
Sorry, it's my first
I
Fire.
just figured out how to get the chat open, guys. I am pro at this. Hello,
You can't
everyone.
click on
Hi,
the
Otter. Hi, cat.
You don't have administrator privileges because you're a woman, but
I am pleb.
So if you want to read out one, I'll click on it so we can do it. Okay, all right. Would you like to start?
Right. Yes. So, if you are unfamiliar with the chapter or with the Game of Thrones TV show, too bad for you, you probably shouldn't be here. Anyway, everyone is familiar with the scene on the beach of Dragonstone where they burn the statues, the wooden statues of the Seven, because Stannis has decided to hitch his horse to the Red Guard R'hllor.
Yes, and specifically they're burning up the Seven because Stannis is like weirdly practical in his religions where he's like, they didn't do a lot for me, so I'm just gonna switch over, which I always thought was sort of like a very funny touch of like, not that he's a religious zealot, but like the view of somebody who's taking on a new religion is like just a very practical.
It's an incongruity. It's a funny little incongruity because people generally don't see religion as something practical.
Yes, exactly. Okay, go ahead and start reading.
Oh, good. Mark it, because then I can use my tab to see it.
Yes. Oh, hey, Courtney.
Hello, Courtney. Oh, everything I am, I own to him. Stannis had raised him to knighthood. He'd have given him a place of honour at his table, a war galley to sail in place of a smuggler's skiff. Dale and Ellard captained galleys as well. Marek was an oarmaster on the Fury. Mathos served his father on Black Betha, and the king had taken Devon as a royal squire. One day he would be knighted, and the two little lads as well. Maria was mistress of a keep on Cape Wrath, with servants to call her Milady, and Davos could hunt red deer in his own woods. All of this he had of Stannis Baratheon, for the price of a few finger joints. I was just what he did to me. I'd flouted the king's laws all my life, and he has earned my loyalty. Davos touched the little pouch that hung from the leather thong around his neck. His fingers were his luck, and he needed it now. As do we all. Lord Stannis most of all.
Right. So this is a good way of I don't think this is the first paragraph or anything, but this is a good way of kind of getting you into Davos's point of view and seeing this is where we talked I think a little bit in Maester Cressen's viewpoint, but like Davos owes everything he is, like he says here, to Stannis. Stannis really raised him up, and the reason the whole thing with the finger bones, just to explain quickly, is that when Stannis was in the middle of a siege and they were running out of food,
during Robert's Rebellion.
Yeah, during Robert's Rebellion, Davos smuggled in a bunch of food, and Stannis was like, that was dope of you, but also you're still a smuggler, so you got to lose the tips of your fingers. And like Davos here is talking about that, about how like it's an idea Stannis will have a lot, and that Martin will actually talk about a lot in terms of like the good does not wash away the bad, and the bad does not wash away the good. Both have to be kind of dealt with. Um, in their both have to be addressed in their own way, and so this is kind of beginning to get into that idea. It is gross. He keeps the monopouch around his neck, though. Like that's just like kind of a weird thing to do.
Well, it's just the bones. It's not the meat as well. It's not like
Yeah.
Jamie and his grizzly toy.
Well, that was that's a gross thing. I think they cut that from the TV show, which I always thought was disappointing. But now I can't remember.
No,
So
there
maybe
was
I'm
one
incorrect.
scene, at least, with him with a hand around his neck.
Okay. But yeah, one of the things that kind of annoys me about Davos is he has a bunch of children, but he never thinks of them. And like the thing is, like, I guess it kind of makes sense in that like he probably isn't really around to raise them in the way we would think of as a father doing so now. One of the things I read talked about how like the medieval conceit of a family is very different than our own. But like he only ever just mentions their names. Very rarely does he A interact with them or B remember them throughout his narrative. It's much more about like his relationship with Stannis is really the one that takes center stage a lot, which is
The book
understandable. But
never overtly tell you this, but he thinks a lot more about the boys that, according to their customs, are still children, because all of these ones he listed off now, except for Devon, are men grown, so they are not technically part of his household anymore.
yeah, that's a good way to put it. I would have liked to see that like explained a little in text because I think it would add some cultural nuance, but it is
You
what
want
it
Martin to
is.
do more explaining?
I mean, sometimes
Aren't
you
you the
remember
one who
that
says that the problem is that he explains everything and gives everyone a point of view?
I would prefer for him to develop his own, Davos a little bit more than add six Greyjoy plot lines, which we will at some point be doing because I actually think those plot lines are quite good. I just don't think they like add to the novel a ton.
It's not
Okay,
six. It's actually
it's
just three. We
mm,
never get Euron Crowseye.
pale hair. We get
Victarion?
Dampus,
Velen?
damp hair,
Victarion.
Rictarian,
Oh,
and
wait.
Asha, and then Tech.
Oh,
Well,
and
Theon
Reek.
doesn't.
I forgot Reek.
Yeah, I think he doesn't really count as a Greyjoy one though, because he mostly like just interacts with the Stark side of
Yeah.
things. You know what I mean? So, okay, read the next part.
Hmm. Pale flames licked at the grey sky. Dark smoke rose, twisting and curling. When the wind pushed it towards men blinked and swept and rubbed their eyes. Allard turned his head away, coughing and cursing. A taste of things to come, thought Davos. Many of more would burn before this war was done.
Um, some good details here, making it more concrete. Uh,
Bringing
yeah,
in atmosphere through
yeah,
the
pretty much.
smoke and also how the smoke affects the people. And I like the little incision of many and more would burn before this war was done.
Yeah, that's something they don't really talk enough about. But like, there's only like one and a half religions uh in Westeros, so like he probably should be considered a bit more of an existential threat than he is. But that gets into issues of religion and like A Song of Ice and Fire is not not super realistic in terms of how it deals with religion. So that's like kind of like a neither here nor there thing. I think it's just not an aspect of the books that Martin really wanted to focus on.
No, but the little work it does with religion, I think, is quite nice.
Yeah, and especially the old gods and the new. Okay, here we go. Here's this is gonna be Lindbergh's Melisandre voice, so let's hear it.
Oh, God. Melisandre was robed all in scarlet satin and blood velvet, her eyes red as the great ruby that glistened at her throat, as if it too were afire. In ancient books of Ashai it is written that there will come a day, after a long summer, when the stars bleed and the cold breath of darkness falls heavy on the world. It is in dread hour a warrior shall rise from the fire, a burning sword, and that sword will be Lightbringer, the red sword of heroes, and he who clasps it will be Azor Ahai come again, and the darkness shall flee before him. She lifted her voice, so it carried out over the gathered host. Azor Ahai, beloved of Relor, the warrior of light, the son of fire, come forth, your sword awaits you. Come forth and take it into your hand.
It's so funny she picked Stannis to be R'hllor because, like, he's so not a prophet. You know what I mean? He's such a practical, like, unassuming guy that it's so funny that he's the one that she was like, okay, no, he's gonna be the prophet to come. And then this is,
Yeah.
I think, the first time in the books that we're really getting any exploration of the whole Lightbringer and Azor Ahai,
Yes,
and that
that's
kind of
why I
stuff.
brought it in, because that is one of the plot lines that the show pretty much decided to drop like a hot potato.
Oh
And it
yeah,
is actually one of the major things that sort of drives Melisandre's interest in Lord Stannis, which made her involvement with him a little bit more confusing, in my opinion.
yeah. It's something that like they just were not. In general, I feel like the show was never interested in the fantasy elements of the books, and so this is something they just kind of dropped after it was no longer was part of the political game of it.
They were mostly interested in the tits and the blood and the fucking, let's be
Yeah,
honest,
that is a good point. And then
which are
secondarily,
all very interesting elements. Granted.
some of them more than others. Did I ever tell you because the thing about the Red Sword of Heroes we'll learn I think later in the book is that he gets it by killing his beloved, and he draws it out, and that's why it's like a fire. And one of the theories is that
You
Lightbringer.
will see it later. We'll have a conversation about it.
Okay, all right, we'll wait for that then. All right, I'll read this part. Stannis Baratheon strode like a soldier marching into battle. Again, there's that funny contrast in his personality. His squires stepped up to attend him. Davos watched as his son Devon pulled a long padded glove over the king's right hand. The boy wore a cream-colored doublet with a fiery heart sewn on the breast. Brian Farron was similarly garbed as he tied a stiff leather cape around his grace's neck. Behind, Davos heard a faint clank and clutter of bells. Under the sea, smoke rises and bubbles, and flames burn green and blue and black. Patchface sang somewhere. I know, oh, oh, oh. So, me and Limburg have a bit of a, if you weren't here for last time, a bit of a difference in opinion in Patchface because I don't love Patchface and you do. Defend him.
I think love is a very strong word, William. You shouldn't just throw it around like that.
Okay, fair enough.
I am amused by Patchface because he says things that you just think sound unhinged, but if you read into it a bit more, it's actually very subtle foreshadowing and it's really creepy, and I love everything that is creepy.
Okay, fair. That was a good rebuttal. I find he's a little cringe, and I hate all things that are cringe. He,
We could not tell at all from your deadpan narration of his words.
look, I read a book like I'm reading it, not like I'm acting it. Um, let's see. Yeah, no. So like, I just don't love him as a character, but yeah, he does occasionally say like prophetic things without meaning to.
Hello, Ola. No, this is not Court of Silver Flames. That is the book that shall not be named. I have read it. It's a
Have you
lot of
really?
cock. Yes, it's a lot of cock being very stinky for hours and hours and hours. And a
Oh,
lot of
there's no.
gaslighting as well, as a fun little cherry on top.
God, is that that's the Nesta book, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Basically, the whole cast of characters gaslights Nesta for about 800 pages, and then she and Cassian fucks.
Well, okay, all right. That is disappointing because I did like Nesta, but also like she becomes less likable the more the author starts to focus on her. God, those books. Like we just couldn't do it. Like I thought about having us do it after we did the first three, and I was just like, I think we're all tired out. We're out of it.
Exactly, Courtney. It's like they never took a shower. It's like they could smell his arousal, and I was like, "Don't,
Uh,
dudes, have you heard of washing?"
that's like in how Ice Planet Barbarians in every bad erotica. It's like the scent of her arousal filled the room like a perfume, or perfumed the air, something like that. And you're like, okay, no, no,
We
no,
could
no,
do
no.
it for the bad book club, Will.
The
You know it's
roasting
gonna
bad books.
happen. You know it's gonna
Uh,
happen.
I don't want to. It's so painful. Okay, all right. The king plunged into the fire with his teeth clenched, holding the leather cloak before him to keep off the flames. He went straight to the mother, grasped the sword with his gloved hand, and wrenched it free of the burning wood with a single hard jerk. Then he was retreating, the sword held high, jade-green flames swirling around cherry-red steel. Guards rushed to beat out the cinders that clung to the king's clothing. "A sword of fire!" shouted Queen Celise. Sir Axel Florent and the other queen's men took up the cry. "A sword of fire! It burns! Sword of fire!" Melisandre lifted her hands above her head. "Behold! A sign was promised, and now a sign is seen. Behold, Lightbringer, Azor Ahai, has come again. All hail the warrior of light. All hail the son of fire." Um, this is all fine. I don't really think there's anything particularly noteworthy about it.
I really like the contrast of the jade green flames and the cherry red steel.
Oh, yeah, that's nice. Then he was retaining sword held high, jade green flames swirling around cherry red steel. Yeah, and I think also what's kind of cool about this is you're gonna be like, oh, is this like real fire? Like, oh, that's crazy. And then I think later we figure out it's like it's show fire. Like it's not
Mm,
like he's like that's one of the things about A Song of Ice and Fire. And what I've always talked about its magic system is it's very plausibly deniable in a lot of ways, and like what is just a weird way of describing something, what's a trick, and what's magic are all sort of mixed together, so you're never quite sure what's going on, or at least you
yes,
aren't in
this
the
is
first few
basically
books.
Melisandre selling them on the concept that Stannis is Azor Ahai because she is entirely convinced of it herself. And
Mm-hmm.
so far, we haven't gotten the reasoning behind how she has arrived at this conclusion. But anyway, I also love his characterization that he is clenching his teeth. That is just peak Stannis.
Yeah,
Like,
that's
I
like
don't
his
want to do this, but I am going to, damn it.
his teeth clenched. Yeah, that's very Stannis. It's very funny. Um, here you can read the next part.
A ragged wave of shouts gave answer just as Stannis' glove began to smoulder. Cussing, the king thrust the point of the sword into the damp earth and beat out the flames against his leg. "Lord, cast your light upon us," Melisandre called out, "for the night is dark and full of terrors." Celise and her queen's men replied. "Shall I speak to her as well?" Davos wondered. "Do I own Stannis that much? As his fiery god truly is on." His shortened fingers twitched.
This is like a nice little touch in terms of like phantom limb pain. We just finished reading a book for the book club. By the way, join our Patreon. You actually probably as of right now are only seeing this if you have joined our Patreon. But if we ever release these to the world as a whole, we have a Patreon. Um, where one of the main characters doesn't have an arm, it got cut off, and like he never feels any phantom limb pain from it at all, or phantom limb sensation at all, and this is very common among people who like lose limbs. Like it's you know.
Indeed, Davos is almost constantly conscious about it. Hello, non anon. The idea is that these streams are going to be a somewhat regular thing once per month,
Yes, we're doing
because
them
Will
once
and
per
I are
month.
both relentless nerds.
So far, I think we've done three, and then I did one on my own before that. I'm gonna be uploading these all to their own channel at some point so that we can share our genius with the masses. But for
Such a
right
man,
now,
Will. You started without me.
Honestly, what happened is I was like, I don't like doing this on my own. I need a co-pilot. And Limburg, again, also a Song of Ice and Fire nerd and very intelligent. So I was like, okay, we can do this. I'll bring her on board. Um, but yeah, so I always like that. This will get a little annoying as the series goes on because it's like just a constant thing. But I think that's just sort of a danger of writing like 9,000, like I was gonna say 9,000 in terms of a lot, but like thousands and thousands and thousands of words from Davos's point of view. Is there's like a limited amount of new things you can have and mannerisms you can have him do.
He could have brought in his sea legs wobbled.
That's true. That's true. Stannis peeled off the glove and let it fall to the ground. The gods in the pyre were scarcely recognizable anymore. The head fell off the smith with a puff of ash and embers. Melisandre sang in the tongue of Ashai, her voice rising and falling like the tides of the sea. Stannis untied his singed leather cape and listened in silence. Thrust in the ground, Lightbringer still glowed ruddy hot, but the flames that clung to the sword were dwindling and dying. By the time the song was done, only charwood remained of the gods, and the king's patience had run its course. He took the queen by the elbow and escorted her back into Dragonstone, leaving Lightbringer where it stood. So this is one of those paragraphs that, like, Martin does this a lot. He doesn't overtell. This is like a nicely symbolic paragraph of what's going on in the dynamic throughout the story without actually saying like, oh, Stannis doesn't value being the Lord of Light. Like, this kind of gives you a sense of anticlimax to it. The king's patience has run its course. This is both that sort of faux medieval language we talked about life last time being very important to kind of creating a setting, and also like, okay, no, he's getting impatient with this whole rigmarole show. Another thing I like is that he takes the queen by the elbow because he really doesn't like Selyse, but he's always very courteous to her, which is a nice character trait. And then leaving Lightbringer where it stood is like, oh, it's kind of impotent there, on its own.
If it was an episode of a TV show, we would see the camera pan towards Lightbringer at the end of this scene. It is that the paragraph evokes. You just
Yes,
see the
that's
sword sitting on the half-dark beach as the flames are slowly going out and the steel is cooling.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point. Martin originally started as a TV writer, so one of the things he tends to think in scenes and visuals to a certain extent, but not in a way that is at the expense of the prose. So, for example, you can't in a part of this. He took the queen by the elbow and escorted her back into Dragonstone, leaving Lightbringer where it stood. That is something that's could be translated to a visual medium very easily, but only and the king's patience had run its course. That's a prose thing. Like, you can't show that in a shot. Although I suppose you could show him like you could figure out how to do this, but in terms
He
of
is
the
using somewhat visual language by introducing the paragraph with Stannis clenching his teeth when he walks to Lightbringer. And
Mhm.
then when he has the red sword of heroes, the sword of prophecy, he just kind of stabs it into the ground and leaves it there and marches away.
Yeah, there's a use of visuals because humans, again, are visual animals primarily. Dogs would just be talking about scent a lot if they wrote fiction. So that's always going to be a part of prose that's important. But, like, and the King's Patience had run its course is not a specifically visual description. So he's kind of using the quirks of prose as a medium to tell his story.
It is
Which is
rather
something.
clever characterization as well. Because
It's
Renly would
understatedly
just
like.
have remained and basked in the glory of everyone's adoration, whereas Stannis is like, oh, that is done, let's go.
Yeah.
We leave it this.
Courtney says Limburg should be an audiobook narrator. Okay, first of all, rude because I've also been reading. But secondly, yes, everybody pressure her on the Discord to become an audiobook narrator. Okay, so the next part is Sir Davos is told by Salador's son that Renly, who has crowned himself king and taken Margaery Tyrell to wife, has left Highgarden and marches on King's Landing. You know what? This should have a comma there. That's right.
Oh my, well.
The Oxford comma, I am a
You
strong
schooled me.
believer. Yeah, that's right.
Schooled
Oxford
me.
comma is important.
Teach the women grammar.
Yeah, but not commas, because that's Katie's forte. Salador Sand is a mercenary that kind of Stannis is forced to work with, who's just, like, not super Stannis is not happy about
He's a
that.
sellsword pirate and an
Sell
old colleague
sail.
of Sir Davos.
Yeah, and it's a mark of how kind of desperate for troops and ships Stannis is. And then the other thing is, just to very quickly remind you, everyone, Renly is Stannis' the other brother who has no claim on the throne, but has basically decided he's awesome. He's gonna become um, a king because he wants to, and he thinks Stannis is lame. And
Yes, I'm thinking
so
we should
yes,
look at Renly's scene where he tells Catelyn Stark why he should be king, because that is just
that's
wonderful.
perfect. Yeah, and it's also important to set up the eventual conversation between Stannis and Renly that
Yes,
we're gonna have to look
exactly.
at because it's such a
We
tour de
are going to
force.
do a sort of overarching view on Stannis's character arc is the idea. So we are kind of going to go through them in chronological order. Wow, English is hard.
She's foreign people in case you couldn't tell.
Yes, I
Yes,
am simple peasant foreigner.
rural peasant. Yeah,
Rural
so
peasant foreigner.
yeah, we're gonna I think at least do I don't know if we'll get all the way through Clash of Kings, but we'll try to do the important highlights before we then move on to something else. Excuse me.
Before our
All right.
attention wanders.
Well, the thing is, like, there's a guy who's been doing, which everyone should check out. He's really fantastic. A reread of the entire series, chapter by chapter, and writing like an analysis of it. And he's been doing it for years, and he's still only in a Storm of Swords. So like, and if we're only doing one a month, that's only 12 a year. So it's kind of like, okay, we got to kind of pick and choose which ones we think are most important. And there's a lot of other chapters like Bran's Last Dream chapter that I really want to do at some point. There's some Danny ones, there's some John ones.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a
There's
lot
the
of good ones.
nipples
So
one.
okay, go ahead and read the next part.
The king must be told. I have attended to it, good sir, though his grace frowns so whether he does see me that I tremble to come before him. Do you think he would like me better if I wore a hair shirt and never smiled? Well, I will not do it. I am an honest man. He must suffer me in silk and samite, or else I shall take my ships where I am better loved. That sword was not Lightbringer, my friend. The
I had
sudden
no
shift
idea
in
this entire
subject
time.
left Davos uneasy.
I had no idea this entire time that Salvador Slan was Eastern European. That's such a what a good choice.
Shut up, Will. You're not helping.
All right, go ahead.
I totally lost my way now. Shh.
The sudden shift.
You and your interruptions. The sudden shift in subject left Davos uneasy. Search? A sword that plucked from the fire, yes. Men tell me things, it is my pleasant smile. How shall a burnt sword serve Stannis? A burnt sword, corrected Davos. Burnt, said Salador-san. And be glad of that, my friend. Do you know the tales of the forging of Lightbringer? I shall tell it to you. It was a time when darkness lay heavy on the world. To oppose it, a hero must have a hero's blade, oh, like none that had ever been. And so for 30 days and 30 nights, Azor Ahai labored sleepless in the temple, forging a blade in the sacred fires. Hit and hammer and fold, hit and hammer and fold, oh yes, until the sword was done. Yet when he plunged it into the water to temper the steel, it burst asunder.
So one thing I do want to note is that Martin will sometimes do this where characters will have a lot of talking. And he's good at writing dialogue, so it works pretty well. And it's also because this is prose, a character describing a thing is much like a thing actually happening on screen. And so like he'll do this throughout, and it never to me feels that annoying. Maybe it does to other people, I don't know. But I think here it's important.
I also think that it's important to note that it is not just any character that goes on these long monologues and tangents. It is a certain kind of character who loves hearing their own voice, basically.
Yeah, that's
Because
very
you will
true.
see the same characters over and over going on these little spiels.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I'll do the next part. Being a hero, it was not for him to shrug and go in search of excellent grapes such as these. So again he began. The second time it took him 50 days and 50 nights, and the sword seemed even finer than the first. Azor Ahai captured a lion to temper the blade by plunging it through the beast's red heart, but once more the steel shattered and split. Great was his woe, and great was his sorrow then, for he knew what he must do. By the way, you should never temper a sword with water or water-based products. That's a great way to get it to shatter or to weaken the steel. So that's just a note that I think is important to remind people.
Smithing is rarely portrayed in a good way in fantasy stories.
Yes, but even that pedantic note apart, I do like the whole idea of plunging it or of tempering it with blood. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute after we get past this part. 100 days and 100 nights he labored on the third blade, and as it glowed white hot in the sacred fires, he summoned his wife. Nissa, Nissa, he said to her, for that was her name, bare your breasts and know that I love you best of all that is in this world. She did this thing, why I cannot say, and Azor Ahai thrust the smoking sword through her living heart. It is said that her cry of anguish and ecstasy left a crack across the face of the moon, but her blood and her soul and her strength and her courage all went into the steel. Such is the tale of the forging of Lightbringer, the red sword of heroes. Now do you see my meaning? Be glad that it is just a burnt sword that his grace pulled from that fire. Too much light can hurt the eyes, my friend, and fire burns. So, this story is really important both to the Stannis' arc in particular, but to the work as a whole in terms of this idea of, like, what are you willing to sacrifice to not just achieve your wants, but for the better good. It's the whole, like, trolley problem to an extent. And I think that, like, that this is, like, such a good encapsulation of it in a story, and to, because as we'll see it in this one, and then especially in A Storm of Swords, where Stannis doesn't do much except maybe think about killing a child or not, it's a question that's very much on Martin's mind, because as he says, you know, the greatest conflict is the human heart at war with itself, I think.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And another theme he has going through these books is that this War of the Five Kings is essentially four kings who have crowned themselves and have aspirations to greatness. And then we have Stannis, who is doing it because he feels that he is king. And at the heart of the story of Azor Ahai is really that Azor Ahai did not choose to become this beloved of R'hllor. He just did what he had to.
Yes.
And it's kind of a message that greatness is not a boon in itself. It is not a crown. It is a burden.
Yeah, and also that it is a burden, which we'll figure out, spoiler alert, in Davos's storyline. It's a burden that you should take on yourself before putting onto others, because in, you know, in A Storm of Swords, the whole thing is like, hey, should I kill this child so that I can kill a king with his blood? And Davos is like, you know, why don't you try everything else first? Why don't you try to save the realm to become its king versus become the king of the realm, put the realm before the horse before the cart and all of that. And so I think that's an extent part of Martin's answer to the trolley problem. Yeah. Do you want to speak on that?
No, you did well. You are
Thank you.
eloquent,
Thank you.
gracious
Thank you.
host.
Thank you. Thank you. Good sir. The other thing is that the fandom loves to try to figure out who Azor Ahai is supposed to be. Pretty much everyone thinks it's either Dany or Jon. And I'm kind of the mind that that was probably a cat, wasn't it?
No. It was a me. I did a thing.
You did a Limburg. But the thing is, I don't actually necessarily think there is one in particular. I think many people could fill that role, and many things could be Lightbringer. Specifically, one theory I did hear, which I did like, is that Lightbringer is actually Dany's dragons. because
I
she
was gonna
got them
say
by.
it's Drogon.
Yes, exactly. Like she got her dragons literally from burning her love, even though that's a whole more complicated thing. But
Yes, but she
and
loved him, even if it's
yes.
sick.
Yes, no, that's true. And they can like literally breathe fire. So like I really like that idea of like the dragons as a weapon because it's just not how you would think of it. One of the things Martin
Yes.
likes with prophecy and imagery in general is to kind of conflate things almost and draw parallels where you wouldn't necessarily expect them and different interpretations of it, which I think
He
are nice.
likes
Oh,
to play with the double-edged sword nature of all prophecy. Basically, prophecy is interpretation of a vague message, and everyone keeps thinking that they are the prophesized main character. Everyone is the main character in their own story.
yeah, exactly. And so like I think that's kind of a cool thing. But again, I don't think there's necessarily going to be like one of these things. I think sometimes the audience gets a little bit more theory mad than Martin actually is.
For reference, if there is an Azor Ahai, I am Team Danny, and I was Team Danny ever since I heard this story, even though I am Team Stannis.
I
What can I
the
say? I'm an unfaithful bitch.
So I think I've told you before. I think that the theory I ascribe to is that Stannis is eventually going to be in charge of holding Winterfell against the zombies and the whites and the others, and eventually he's going to burn his daughter to birth a dragon because it's been mentioned several times that there are dragon eggs in Winterfell, and when he does that, when he finally sacrifices an innocent to fix the when he finally runs over the one person to save the three, by doing so he's actually going to create dragons of like shadow and ice, and like that'll be kind of the answer to the trolley problem is like, well, when you do sacrifice an innocent for the good of many, you create more of a problem, which I think thematically would be powerful, and also why the showrunners were like, oh, the daughter has to burn. Like they just fundamentally misunderstood all of the themes, but remembered that that was a thing that happened. But that's we don't
It's
know if
fancy.
we're
It's pretty deep into fan theory territory now.
yes, and
And also,
also
I don't like to think about your theory because it is depressing me. Poor
it's a
Stannis.
tragedy.
He deserved better.
We'll see. I mean, unfortunately, we may never actually get an answer, so we're not going to talk about that. But that may also be the case. Okay. Stannis has called for an audience with Sir Davos. I like the font you put this in, by the way. That it's not just Times New Roman. Looks fancy.
Thank you. It is I am Fell English Primer. It's an old-timey font.
And it was tiny font. All right. You can read the next part.
Stannis sat at his painted table with Maester Pylos at his shoulder, an untidy pile of papers before them. Sir, the king said when Davos entered, come have a look at this letter. Obediently, he selected a paper at random. It looks handsome enough, your grace, but I fear I cannot read the words. Oh, he's Scottish now for some reason.
Lower
Davos
class
could
person.
decipher maps and charts as well as any, but letters and other writings were beyond his powers. But my Devon has learnt his letters, and young Stefan and Stannis as well.
So I like this because this is a very of the world thought, and it's also a very father thought of like, I'm proud of my sons that they're going to do better than I did, and that's just like a small character beat, but I think it actually adds a lot. And for those who don't know, we're here to obsess about all the little things. So don't in the comments be like, I don't get why you're focusing on the. This is why we're here. All right. This
Yeah,
is what's up.
it's a very nice comment on class that even though Davos was a smuggler, he does not
Hmm.
read.
Yeah,
And
and he's I
also,
think
it's a bit of a character building detail also because you can immediately tell that he is self conscious about this.
yeah, and it's worth pointing out. I think he's the only character in the main cast who can't read, but it makes sense because he's the character who is like lowest class.
He's the lowborn character.
Yeah, this also is something that like we talked before about how a lot of fantasy worlds are just very much like the modern world, but with like swords and horses. And this is something where it's like, no, we have an expectation that everyone can read, but that is not the case in a pre-industrial, pre-newspaper world. Okay, I had forgotten. A furrow of irritation showed between the king's brows. Pylos, read it to him. Oh, here, I'm curious about Pylos' voice.
Your Grace. The master took up one of the parchments that cleared his throat. All men know me for the true-born son of Stephen Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, by his lady wife Cassana of the House Eastermont. I declare upon the honour of my house that my beloved brother Robert, our late king, left no true-born issue of his body, the boy Joffrey, the boy Tommen, and the girl Myrcella, being abominations born of incest between Cersei Lannister and her brother Jaime the Kingslayer. By right of birth and blood, I do this day lay claim to the Iron Throne of the Seven Kingdoms of Westeros. Let all true men declare their loyalty, done in the light of the Lord, under the sign and seal of Stannis of House Baratheon, the first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, and Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. The parchment rustled softly as Pylos laid it down.
So this is just laying out the political ramifications. Make it Sir Jaime the Kingslayer henceforth, Stannis said, frowning. Whatever else the man may be, he remains a knight. I don't know what we ought to call Robert my beloved brother, either. He loved me no more than he had to, nor I him. A harmless courtesy, your grace, Pylos said. A lie. Take it out. So this is such a great Stannis moment. And this is just, This is Stannis to a T, which is like he is not willing to even be polite because he views that as a lie. And like,
well, in a sense, he is polite as well, Sir Jaime the Kingslayer.
Yes,
because
exactly.
He is very much. It is correct. He is all about political correctness. You shan't deny a man what he is owed simply because you do not like him or what he has done.
Exactly. It goes back to that idea of the good does not wash out the bad and the bad does not wash out the good. He is like that idea and ideology,
Stannis
like
believes
crystallized.
in the law. Reward good service and punish misdeeds. One does not cancel out the other.
Yeah. And it's funny because this is something I think one of the reasons I identify with Stannis so much is because this is a thing in my life that I run into all the time, which is that I'm sort of very unyielding on small courtesies like this if I don't believe them. Like, I'm really, I just feel very strongly about not lying about small things. If even if they would make things easier to go down, like an easier pill to swallow. And I think we all in life are kind of tempted to fly a little bit here and there. And like I don't agree with that.
I don't Stannis is my spirit animal.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel very strongly about like that I don't want to lie. I don't want to say something that is deceitful in some way because I think it always comes back to you at some point. It will always kind of return to you, not like in a metaphysical, like not in a spiritual way or a metaphysical way, but kind of on like a gestalt, like small things adding up together. And I think it changes who you are when you lie to people. And then Courtney says Stannis is hilarious. He really is too, in a very deadpan way.
Stannis's jokes are the best. I love them so much.
It's so funny. All right, you can read this next part.
Actually, you skipped a harmless courtesy, Your Grace.
Pylos no, I did that part.
No, I don't think you did. Anyway,
I think I did. Because that's the thing is like Pylos is like we're just being polite, and he's like no, no.
A lie, take it out. Stannis turned to Davos. The maester tells me we have 117 ravens on hand. I mean to use them all. 117 ravens will carry 117 copies of my letter to every corner of the realm, from the arbor to the wall. Perhaps 100 will win through against Storm and Hawk and Arrow. If so, 100 maesters will read my words to as many lords in as many solas and bedchambers. And then the letters will, like as not, be consigned to the fire. and lips pledged to silence. These great lords love Joffrey, or Renly, or Robb Stark. I am the rightful king, but they will deny me if they can. So I have need of you.
And this is something that Stannis is both very sullen about, but also Stannis very much understands realpolitik, even if he himself doesn't do it all the time. Like he actually has a very good understanding of how other people act, which I think is kind of interesting, because you would think for someone who's so ideologically pure, he wouldn't necessarily, but he very much does.
Stannis is funny because he has a very clear-eyed view of where men's hearts lie, unless they lie with Stannis. Then he has a complete blind spot for him. So he says, these great lords love Joffrey or Renly or Robb Stark. He doesn't even include himself in that thought. And
Yes,
the funny thing
exactly.
is that how many of the great lords truly love Joffrey? It's like Stannis has such little brother complex. It's like they love everyone but me.
Yeah. Yeah, he really does. And, to go back to Spear Breaks the Water that we were just reading about, one of the main villains in that has a little brother complex, but it's mostly just for villainous ends, where throughout the series we'll really get a sense for Stannis and how that kind of affected him as a person. And
Well,
how, yeah.
you just said the spirit breaks the water.
The spear breaks the water, and the spear bears its teeth, apparently. That's how I said the teeth bears its spirit, I think is what I said last time. That's really funny. Okay. I'm yours to command, my king, as ever. Stannis nods. I mean for you to sail Black Betha north, to Gulltown the Fingers, the Three Sisters, even White Harbor. Your son Dale will go south in Wraith, past Cape Wrath and the Broken Arm, all along the coast of Dorne as far as the Arbor. Each of you will carry a chest of letters, and you will deliver one to every port and holdfast and fishing village. Nail them to the doors of septs and inns for every man to read who can. Davos said, that will be few enough. Sir Davos speaks truly, your grace, said Maester Pylos. It will be better to have the letters read aloud. Better, but more dangerous, said Stannis. These words will not be kindly received. Give me a knight to do the reading, Davos said. That will carry more weight than anything I might say. Yeah, again, Stannis actually Stannis is interesting because I think almost more than any of the other lord kings and stuff and lords, he's almost coded, or he's not. He's still coded as a king, but he is very much a military man almost before anything else. Because you have to think about his upbringing. Yes, he was born as the son of a high lord, but like he seems to very much, like his men are very faithful to him, and he seems like very much the kind of person who doesn't, he's not going to bring his luxuries on campaign if his men can't have them as well. And he, has spent most of his life living in like a shitty little castle in the middle of nowhere. So to be king, he would be rising the most. Though I don't know. I think he actually was in King's Landing for a while.
Yeah, he sat on the King's Council.
Yeah,
He
I was gonna say
wanted
maybe.
to scourge all the horse into the sea.
So maybe not. Maybe ignore everything I just said, guys. I would cut it out, but I'm too lazy. Um, Stannis seemed. Oh well, you can read this part.
Stannis seemed well satisfied with that. I can give you such men, yes. I have 100 knights who would sooner read than fight. Be open where you can and stealthy where you must. Use every smuggler's trick the black sails, the hidden coves, whatever it takes. If you run short of letters, capture a few septons and set them to copying out more. I mean to use your second son as well. He will take Lady Maria across the narrow sea to Bravos and the other free cities to deliver other letters to the men who rule there. The world will know of my claim and Cersei's infamy.
Again, Stannis immediately understands like warfare, or not warfare, information warfare, and in this time and day here in our Lord of 2024, I think we all understand how important fake news can be to deciding the ruling of a country. There's
Indeed.
actually a funny part later in this book where Tyrion and Cersei will read this letter he put out, and then Tyrion's like, well, no, don't kill people who read it. Just put out an even more ridiculous letter about, the stuff he's been up to. And everyone's like, nobody's going to believe that. And Tyrion's like, yeah, they might, because A, it's a good story, but B, it will just muddy the waters. So now we just have two competing claims, and people will be like, well, if one person said a ridiculous thing, the other thing they said must be. People have a very instinctual urge to kind of think that the truth is somewhere between 2 points, and so if you create one point way more ridiculous than the other, people are like, well, maybe, and it moves that median view towards that toward farther to one side than to the other. And so like I've always thought this was like a very kind of canny thing that the books explore
Yes.
a little bit.
And I feel like Stannis also understands that. Well, Stannis is kind of telling him that he does not believe anyone will come to him because they like him. He just takes that out of the equation. So he's like, everyone will hear of my claim, and
That's
perhaps we
true.
shall turn the just and the rightful to our cause.
Yes,
And
no,
if
that's
nothing
true.
else, we might weaken the bonds between Cersei and her allies. He understands that behind Joffrey is Cersei and the Lannisters. The power does not really lie with Joffrey.
Yeah. I also like the turn of phrase, I have 100 knights who would sooner read than fight.
Yeah,
Because it's a great
it's
little.
Stannis humor.
Yeah, it is very Stannis humor of like, yeah, all right, they ain't shit. And also just in terms of the series as a whole, and it's that thing where Martin uses language where he sets up something and then he like kind of subverts it in the next sentence. Um, I've
Hey,
never, and I
Soko.
talked about, I've never been able to figure out. Oh, hey, what's up? Yeah, I've never quite been able to figure out a word for it, but Martin does this thing with language a lot. Um, you can tell them, Davos thought, but will they believe? He glanced thoughtfully at Maester Pylos. The king caught the look. Maester, perhaps you ought to get to your writing. We will need a great many letters, and soon. As you will. Pylos bowed and took his leave. The king waited until he was gone before he said, "What is it you would? What is it you would not say in the presence of my maester, Davos?" My liege, Pylos is pleasant enough, but I cannot unsee the chain about his neck without mourning for Maester Crescent. It is his fault the old man died. Stannis glanced into the fire. I never wanted Creston at that feast. He'd angered me, yes. He'd given me bad counsel, but I did not want him dead. I, I'd hoped he might be granted a few years of ease and comfort. He had earned that much, at least, but he ground his teeth together. But he died, and Palos serves me ably. Um, yeah, so this is kind of addressing Crescent's death from the first chapter, which, like, again, I always
Mm.
felt was like a little unfair, and like Stannis maybe should have been a little more cool about. But we talked about
Yes, but
that.
look how indirectly Stannis is also saying that he does care that Crescent died. He grounds his teeth and he avoids saying how the Maester died. It is very clear that it causes him emotion, and Stannis doesn't like emotion, especially not
Yeah,
showing it.
yeah, and also even just the I'd hoped he might be granted a few years of ease and comfort. That's like a
Mm-hmm.
very nice sentiment. It makes you realize, like, oh no, Stannis did care. He did like the guy. He just,
Yeah, and
he
it
was
sort
rude
of
at a
turns
feast.
around it because the last we saw in Maester Crescent's prologue, Stannis seemed pretty cold and dismissive of Crescent, and now we kind of see the other coin, the other side of the coin, because here he is with Davos in private, and
Mm-hmm.
he shows more of his true feelings.
Yeah, and it's important for the character because you might think, okay, this isn't really plot relevant, and it isn't, but it's important for our understanding of Stannis because we cared about Crescent as a character. That if it never really went addressed, we would have a less clear view of Stannis. And so like
Mm.
this is just a small character thing that it's still important to include. Pylos is the least of it. The letter. What did your lords make of it? I wonder. And you may read the next part.
Stannis snorted. Celtigar pronounced it admirable. If I showed him the contents of my privy, he would declare that admirable as well. The others bobbed their heads up and down like a flock of geese, all but Velaryon, who said the steel would decide the matter, not words on parchment. As if I'd never suspected. The others take my lords, I'll hear your views. Your lords were blunt and strong, and true, yet You have no proof of this incest, no more than you did a year ago.
So, yeah, this is Stannis like understanding when people ain't shit. And it's very funny, and it's it also endears us to him because he's like, rich people suck. What do you think? Um, which is like, it's not cheap, but I think it is a very indicative of Stannis. And again, it's an important part of like, if Stannis was like Renly, where he was like upper class and snobby, and then also had the ideology he has, it would undercut the message that Martin is trying to explore through him. Um, and and so I think it's actually a very important part of his character that he is impartial in this way. It's not just an act to kind of like punish people he doesn't like.
It
But
also
there,
speaks very clearly to what Stannis values in other humans, because it is very clear
yes,
that he is very dismissive and critical of people who acquiesce and who brown nose and just try to please to serve their own purposes.
yeah, exactly. Um, let's see. Okay. There's a proof of a sword at Storm's End, Robert's bastard, the one he fathered on my wedding night in the very bed they made up for me and my bride. The Lena was a Florent and a maiden when he took her, so Robert acknowledged the babe. Edric Storm, they call him. He's said to be the very image of my brother. If men were to see him and then look again at Joffrey and Tommen, they could not help but wonder, I would think. Um, Yet how are men to see him if he is at Storm's End? Stannis drummed his fingers on the painted table. It is a difficulty, one of many. He raised his eyes. You have no more to say about the letter. Well, get on with it. I did not make you a knight so you could learn to mouth empty courtesies. I have my lords for that. Say what you would say, Davos. Davos bowed his head. There was a phrase at the end. How did it go? Done in the Lord of the Light? Yes, the king's jaw was clenched. Your people will mislike those words. As you did, said Stannis sharply. If you were to say instead, done in the sight of gods and men, or by the grace of the gods old and new, have you gone devout on me, smuggler? That was to be my question for you, my liege. Was it now? It sounds as though you love my new god no more than you love my new maesters. Let me go back actually up, because before this, when they were talking about Edric Storm is going to become very important to Stannis' character development, so it's good that they're exploring it here at the beginning. It also kind of gets to how difficult paternity is to understand in a pre-24, 23 and me kind of world. Of like, well, it's all sort of ambiguous. You don't really have proof. You're actually lucky that like all of I think who is it? I think it's Tyrion at one point points out that if like Cersei had had one of Robert's kids, it would have made the whole thing much less likely for anyone to believe. Because it at least would have been
Mm-hmm.
like one dark-haired kid among three, but like no, but and like that is actually a nice character touch I liked about Cersei too, which is like she isn't practical in her hatred of Robert. She really hated him, and so like no, not one of his kids was she going to bear, even though it would have made her life easier. It's one of the ways that Cersei has no soft edges, and I respect that, and I also think that that says something about like the female rage kind of theme in her work or in her chapters.
Female rage. Mm.
That's a trope. I keep hearing about it
I know
because
it's a trope. I know it's a trope, and I hate it. I
I mean
hate the connotations of the phrase female rage.
I get it in that like, or at least I think I get it in terms of like there is something very validating about just going on a rip roaring rampage of revenge kind of a thing. And so some people very much want to experience that wish fulfillment. But I find often in books and stuff like it works for like a horror movie, but in a book like um there's too much to which just the real implications of it in a book that's like 7 to 8 hours long is different than in a revenge movie, which you're not supposed to take super seriously, which is like 2 hours long. And so when it's used in fiction, I feel like often it's just an excuse to be a bad person.
Yes, and also just the semantics of it. Female rage. Why are we gendering rage?
Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Yeah.
It is entirely unnecessary. A man in Cersei's situation would be as raging as she is.
Yes, but I think it also speaks to a certain kind of genericized um, experience that a certain group of people feel more than others. Like it's not a lot of people in the same position feel the same way about it. You know what I mean? Like I think
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
kind of what it
I
speaks to.
guess that they want to make it a colloquial term, like we want to talk about women's rage at the lot we have been handed in life. But I hate it when you view it from the other side of the conversation, where men are like, "Oh, feminism's gone too far." Oh, what's that word for the opposite of misogyny? Misandry.
Misandry.
It's just misandry. It's like
I actually
that's
kind of,
why I
yeah,
don't like female rage.
the optics of it aren't great, and again, a lot of times it feels more like an excuse for the person to be a bad person. Like Iron Widow is a book that I've read that I felt that about. I think also there is a certain extent to which I talked about this with the military once in one of our reviews about how military PTSD and estrangement from society tends to actually be used by authors as a kind of juvenile wish fulfillment to feel different and like haggard and cool. And I feel like sometimes that happens with social justice concepts is they become an outlet for a certain teenage sense of non-belonging and being mad at the world in a way that isn't necessarily reflective of the real life experiences and a mature view of society. And I think that's a lot more of an iffy kind of topic that you could go back and forth on, but I do think that can sometimes happen.
Could you highlight Soto's comment?
I think the choice of the word female is to indicate that it's like primal, but it becomes kind of gender essentialist. Um,
Yes, that is
yeah, I
exactly
think
what I was trying to say. Thank you, Soto.
fair enough. The class rage might be a better term, or like a marginalized rage. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, no, that's true. That's actually a good point. Okay, so one thing I said is I have my lords for that. Say what you want to say, Davos. Again, this kind of plays to the um the truth. How much Stannis believes in his ideology, even when it's uncomfortable for him, is he wants the truth. He wants people to be truthful with him, and so he's going to encourage that in people. Um. Okay, so go ahead and read the next part.
I do not know this, Lord of Light, Davos admitted, but I knew the goods we burned this morning. The smith has kept my ship safe while the mother has given me 7 strong sons. Your wife has given you 7 strong sons, stoop right there. It was wood we burned this morning. Maybe so, Davos said. But when I was a boy in Flea Bottom, begging for a copper, sometimes the Septons would feed me. I feed you now. You have given me an honoured place at your table, and in return I give you truth. Your people would not love you if you take from them the gods they have always worshipped and give them one whose very name sounds queer on their tongues. Stannis stood abruptly. The law? Why is that so hard? They would not love me, you say? When have they ever loved me? How can I lose something I never owned? He moved to the south window to gaze out at the stormlit sea. I stopped believing in gods the day I saw the wind proud break up across the bay. Any god so monstrous as to drown my mother and father would never have my worship, I vowed. In King's Landing, the House High Septon would prattle at me of how all justice and goodness flowed from the seven, but all I ever saw of either was made by men.
But this is kind of an interesting discussion about religion in general, and it's a little ahistorical for a medieval period, but books are meant to be read by people nowadays, not people in medieval times. Um, Both speaking to the way that religion can be symbols versus not. So he says, like, I just burned the wood. Like, I didn't say you had to not to. And Davos is like, yeah, but they're directly connected to them in terms of how people think about it. And then Stannis goes on his, like, I'm a sullen second son thing, which I think is very funny. But I think it's also important that, like, as a prophet, or not a prophet, but as like the prophet of this culture, of this new religion, he's just so practical about it, and he doesn't really believe it.
No, Stannis does not believe, and he also doesn't truly understand because what Davos says is that you burned the people's emotion, and Stannis doesn't understand acting purely from emotion. That is why he's so resentful of the people who do not love him either, because he does not know really how to elicit love in other people. He does not know how to connect with it. I also
Yeah,
really, really love his little spiel about how the Septon talks of justice and goodness, but all he saw of either was made by men. That speaks very clearly to Stannis's view of the world.
and it's very interesting because for the most part, Stannis comes off as a very kind of misanthropic, kind of cynical character. But it's an interesting
Mm.
idea that yeah, no, he sees it as he sees justice and goodness coming from people. I think you kind of forget this line because he never actually acts on it throughout the rest of the series, except for like Davos is the only person he seems to really like. Uh, but it also speaks to the fact that he's just not very like emotional and flowery about goodness and beauty and
I
stuff
think
like that.
Davos is one of the few people Stannis respects.
Yes, yes, that's
We
very
could
true.
say like, but I think it's more about he respects Davos's unflinching straightforwardness. And since that's something they have in common, he knows how to connect with Davos in a way he does not know how to connect with these fatuous, vacuous men who are the
Yeah,
High Lords.
and also because like by letting Stannis cut off his fingers, like Davos showed the commitment to the same ideology that Stannis has that like
Mm-hmm.
no one else has. Like Stannis is very distrustful of just what people say versus what they do, and so Davos was like, "No, this is I'm with you on this," and Stannis really respects that. I think even people he sort of respects but doesn't trust like he does Davos. Like he clearly respects Jon Snow when he meets him in Storm of Swords. But like
Mm-hmm.
he's still kind of wary of him, and he still is like, well, you're not on my side, so we're gonna be weird about it. I think he really respects action a lot in that way.
It is very funny because they are very similar people and they kind of respect each other because of it. But because they're also very similar people, they hold their position in the struggle first over their emotions towards each other. So they're kind of eyeing each other on the opposite sides of the same chasm and trying to build a bridge over it. And it's a very fun dynamic, I
Yeah,
think.
it's totally true because by Stannis' ideology, Jon Snow has pledged himself to the Night's Watch, which is specifically a um, political entity. And so, like, he should respect that John is like, no, I'm not going to give you any troops. No, I'm not going to give you any of the resources of the wall. That's crazy. And so, but Stannis is like, I got to be practical in this case. Why won't you just help me out? But where he really should just be like, no, you're right. I can't ask for it. And that's part of Stannis' arc is also getting that kind of challenge throughout of
Hmm.
like, okay, I have to bend a little bit more than I would like.
Yeah. Can I read the last part?
Yeah, yeah. Let's just read it through.
Please. If you do not believe in gods, what trouble with this one? Stannis broke in. I've asked myself as well. I know little and care less for gods, but the Red Priestess has power. Yes, but what sort of power? Crescent had wisdom. I trusted in his wisdom and your wiles, and what did they avail me, smuggler? The Stormlord sent you packing. I went to them a beggar, and they laughed at me. Well, there will be no more begging, and no more laughing either. The Iron Throne is mine by rights, but how am I to take it? There are 4 kings in the realm, and all 3 of them have more gold and more men than I do. I've ships, and I've her, the Red Woman. Half my knights are afraid to even say her name, did you know? If she can do nothing else, a sorceress who can inspire such dread in grown men is not to be despised. A frightened man is a beaten man. and perhaps she can do more. I mean to find out. When I was a lad, I found an injured goshawk. Will, your
Yeah, there we go. Go ahead. So, somehow you put that in there, which I like as a touch, but yeah, go ahead.
I'm just bombing you out to to the great
It's
public
okay.
out there. I'm so sorry. I was trying to figure out how to send you the link. Anyway,
It's totally okay.
when I was a lad, I found an injured goshawk and nursed her back to health. Proudwing, I named her. She would perch on my shoulder and flutter from room to room after me and take food from my hand. But she would not soar. Time and time again, I would take her hawking, but she never flew higher than the treetops. Robert called her Weakwing. He owned a grey falcon called Thunderclap, who never missed a strike. One day our great uncle Sir Herbert told me to try a different bird. I was making a fool of myself with Proudwing, he said, and he was right. Stannis Baratheon turned from the window, and the ghosts who moved upon the southern sea. The Severn never had brought me so much as a sparrow. It is time I tried another hawk. Davos, a red hawk.
So Martin really knows how to build up these sentences that hit you with like a bam at the end, and like that's such a good sentence to end on. A red hawk.
Yeah,
Um,
you think he's just gone on a tangent or an
hmm
anecdote that will not tie back, but then he does.
Yeah, and it's very nice in that way. It's a good, and again, this is just him being butthurt a lot about how much the world has mistreated him.
Yeah,
Um,
well, Robert wasn't very nice to him, was he?
isn't there another story about Stannis and Robert and a hawk, or am I misremembering that entirely? I
No,
thought there
it's
was.
it's the hawk is this one. And also
Oh.
there was the Robert fucking a woman in Stannis's bed. It was Robert giving Storm's End to Renly. It
Yeah, no,
was
he's
Robert not making Stannis his hand. I mean, Robert
yeah.
was a bit of a bastard to Stannis, let's be honest.
Robert did not like Stannis, which again is so funny because he liked Ned. He was like the same well, not the same person, but like a similar kind of person. Um,
Yes,
yeah,
science.
this
What do you mean Martin makes sentence and conversation count? Never heard of it.
again, Martin has a really deft hand with dialogue that really helps him. And again, I mean, increasingly noticing the ways that he can build ideas up to hit you in a moment. Again, the biggest example of this is the Red Wedding, which is like built up so much that when it hits, everybody describes it as such a powerful moment. But he does this throughout his writing constantly. I think he also something he picked up from movie or not movie from TV writing is that you kind of always need to end a chapter with a little bit of a hook for the next chapter, and usually
Mm.
that's a thing that has to do with commercials, and that like TV shows really happen in like 5 chapters essentially, and so you always want to leave the audience at the end of right before the commercial break a little bit of a hook to stay around for it. And I think that serves
Yes.
them really well in a book that has so many characters and chapters in it.
So many point of views, so many differing plot lines, so many character
Yeah.
arcs. Each chapter tends to start out one way, and then by the end, the chapter has sort of made its statement
Yeah,
that it
I
wants
think
to leave you with.
yeah, exactly. And I think it's I think it's because again, I always remember that when people are like, "Well, his prose are okay, but they're very workmanlike," and I'm like, "No, he's able to build these really nice moments that have like impact in you." And the never and it also like this is also just a nice way of like him being like, no, I'm not gonna say exactly this thing I'm thinking. I'm just gonna say a thing close to it, and that helps it feel not very like telly. It helps it feel more showy, um,
Hmm.
which
And
I think is
also,
good.
Stannis is a lord, and being a lord, everything is about them. So they go on these little tangents and talking about these little anecdotes that involve their life, and they just kind of expect everyone to listen.
That's actually a very good point,
You'll
too.
never see the small folk do this, really.
No, the only one is the Broken Men speech from A Feast of Crows, and that's in like a different kind of context of two
Yeah,
like lower class people speaking essentially. Um,
yeah.
yeah,
And
TV dramas have a 5 arc structure. Yeah, exactly. Which I actually think is part of the problem with streaming services sometimes is that writers don't quite know how to handle having just one long unbroken um, uh, time section. Um,
mhm. I think, Otter, you have a very valid point.
would it
Would
be
it be
weird
weird
to
to
say
say
that
that
it's
it sounds like it would sometimes be fatiguing to read something like this straight through? I don't think it is weird to say it at all because these little excerpts clearly show that if you do keep attention to every single sentence, you are rewarded for it because they tie into each other. It is not a book that is just packed with lots of fluff in general, but it is also very intensive.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's also one of these things where when you break it down as an analysis, it comes off as more tiring than it is in reading it because in reading it it flows by so quickly and effortlessly. Um and that's something I've often said about audiobooks is audiobooks it's hard to notice good or bad prose because it just they come in and they go out so quickly. And I kind of feel like that's how it works here. And then also there's so much dynamism in terms of switching between characters and plot lines and such.
Mhm. But we are also people who have spent an awful lot of time thinking about this and reading this. I have
Mm-hmm.
probably read Clash of Kings between 10 and 15 times.
Jesus. I've read it
Yeah.
a lot. I don't know that I've read it that many times, but I've read it a lot. I will say that. Um,
Hmm. But also,
uh,
on Stannis's little spiel about his little goshawk, I because in Crescent's prologue,
mm,
Crescent talked a little about how Stannis was the child that never learned how to smile or laugh, how he was sullen and kind of outcast from his brothers. And I think this little story nicely illustrates that he is an emotional person. He found a goshawk and he named her Proudwing and he nursed her like he did this to an animal that he didn't really have much to gain from, really. He just did it because he liked his little hawk.
mm-hmm.
And then Robert showed up and shamed him for this emotional investment in an animal. And instead of just shrugging it off, Stannis took it as a life's lesson. Do not act
Yes.
on emotion. Turn off emotion. Hide it.
Yeah, it's not rewarded, and partly that's also because his parents died. Like he and his brothers were parentalized at a very young age, um,
Mhm.
in a certain
Indeed.
way. So, I believe the next part after this, actually, I don't know what comes next in the book. The book of
Do you mean in
Is it?
Stannis' arc?
Yes. This is one of the few books
Mm,
that I own. This is A Feast for Crows. Never mind. But yeah, we'll eventually get to the Shadow Baby scene, which people I know are waiting for. And then we'll also, yeah, I think Renly's scene with Catelyn is really important, and then Renly and Stannis's discussion is really important. I don't know that
yeah.
Stannis in the second half of the book is super important, so we may end after like the whole Shadow Baby arc. But we'll see. We'll play around with it, and or um, Lindbergh will read through it, and I will just agree and pretend that I did the research because that's what happened this time. Thanks to her for getting this chapter together.
You were
But
going to get back to me to see if I picked out the good bits. Do
I
you
actually
remember
did.
that?
I looked through it last night, and I was like, okay, these all seem pretty good. I just didn't have a chance to read the chapter itself.
Hmm.
It's
I
I've
think that from here, the next thing is that Stannis lays siege to Storm's End to get the bastard, if I
yeah,
remember
okay, so
correctly.
yeah, the next thing to do actually then would be the Catelyn chapter where she's hanging around Renly, and like
But don't quote me on that. These books
Uh,
are very long.
some people have noted that. All right, any last thoughts on this chapter?
I love Stannis. Could I marry Stannis? Can you marry a fictional character?
Wait, I thought it was the one from War and Peace that you wanted to marry.
Oh, but Pierre is already taken. He has Nastia.
That's fair. Celis is not exactly a good match for Stannis. So.
I mean, Stannis has a wife, but he's already shown that he's into the poly lifestyle.
Oh,
You
that's
know.
true. Yeah, 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 yeah. That's a good point. Polyrep. Um, all right. We will talk to you all later.
Thank you guys for showing up. Bye.